there's any declarations of interest for the record.
Yeah.
Chris?
So I've been a member of two of the three unions represented here today. That's the RMT and the TSSA, and I have worked indirectly for two of the witnesses in panel 2.
Okay.
Thanks, Chair. In former times, before privatisation, I worked for British Rail, and I was a member of the NUR, which was a forerunner of the RMT. I was also a member of the TSSA, and I'm also a member of a number of trade union groups, including ASLEF and the RMT parliamentary group.
Thank you. Anyone else of declaration?
I'm a member of the RMT parliamentary group.
Thank you. Good morning to our panel. Thank you for your time this morning. Just for the record, could I ask you to give your name and position, starting Mr. Whelan.
Good morning, Chair. I'm Mick Lynch. I'm General Secretary of the Train Drivers Union, ASLEF.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Frank Ward, Interim General Secretary of the TSSA.
Thank you.
Yeah, good morning. Mick Lynch, General Secretary at RMT.
Thank you. My colleagues and I will have a number of questions for you all this morning, and we'll delve into what is quite a complex situation. But before we do, I just want to put the session in context. We're hearing from yourselves in this part of the session. Later we'll be hearing from Network Rail and the Rail Delivery Group, and next week we'll be having the Rail Minister in front of us. What I'm hoping we get out of these sessions is to get some greater clarity on where we are with the dispute and what the prospects are of a resolution sooner rather than later. So before we delve into the specific issues, can I just ask the three of you, in very broad terms, how close are we to having these disputes resolved? On a, let's say, on a scale of 1 to 10, whereas 1, you remain on different planets, 10, I can go out and buy a hat for the wedding. Where are we, Mr. Whelan?
Thank you, Chair. I think you include 0 in your 1 to 10, and we're further away than when we started.
Okay, that's clear. Mr. Ward?
I wouldn't disagree with that.
Okay, Mr. Lynch?
I wouldn't be able to say. It depends on discussions. I'm not going to use a scale, but we haven't got an agreement, and until we get an agreement, we're not close to it, really.
Okay, well, that's not as optimistic as I'd hoped. So, are discussions happening at the moment?
No.
Okay.
We've been invited to discussions tomorrow.
Yeah, discussions are... We had a discussion with Network Rail yesterday, and we'll be having one with the RDG, Rail Delivery Group, for the TOCs on Thursday.
And can you see... Start with you, Mr. Lynch, because you seem to be the most positive of the three, although it's relative. Where do you see a possible landing zone for an agreement? Is it on pay? Is it on the wider conditions, industry reform? Where do you see a possible zone for coming to an agreement?
Well, all of those issues have to be dealt with. Our dispute that we put to the companies is based on job security, so they wanted to make thousands of redundancies. That may change to lower thousands or into hundreds, we don't know. That's Network Rail and the TOCs. We have got an issue about what they're calling modernisation, and there are some aspects of modernisation, development of the railway and development of working conditions and terms and conditions and contractual elements. But we're a long way on pay. I mean, the inflation rate that we use for this year is currently in excess of 14%. And that's the one that the railway use. The previous offer we had is 4%. The cumulative inflation for 22 and 23 will be in excess of 20%. We've been offered on the TOCs 8% for those 2 years, so it's less than half, and we've been offered 9% by the Network Rail, which is less than half again. But let's not forget, we haven't had a pay rise in many of these companies for 3 and 4 years. So we are having our wages reduced, spending power at the supermarket and with the energy companies and everything else, year on year on year, and every week that passes it gets worse. They're also seeking such drastic changes, such as the elimination of ticket offices in Britain. There will be no, under their current proposals, which are sponsored and put forward by the Department for Transport, there will be no ticket offices. And the last version of the offer that we had from the talks, there will be no guards either. So these are very stark choices. Plus they want to dilute all of our contractual terms and conditions virtually. So it's a very strong challenge for us. And even if a revised package comes forward on that basis, which includes elements as far as the government wants to be addressed, and this is completely directed by the government in every element, I don't know if any of our members will go anywhere near accepting those proposals. They are such profound changes that they'll be very difficult for any union to accept. And one of the previous times I was here, we had the P&O chairman and said, no, he said to us, said this committee, no union in its right mind would accept what I want to propose or would have proposed. And we're in similar territory with the railways at the moment. So the landing zone will have to deal with all of those elements, as it's called, but I can't see the landing zone from here. We'll have to see what the talks say, and I don't know what our members will make of that when they get to read this stuff in detail.
And Mr. Ward, your union settled with one of the disputes, but remain, that was with Network Rail, but you remain in dispute with the RDG.
Yep.
From what you agreed with Network Rail, can you see a sort of spillover, if that's the correct phrase, to reaching a settlement with the RDG?
Well, we had two agreements with Network Rail, one on behalf of management staff, which we entered into last August, and then one on behalf of general grades and controllers, which was settled in December. The concerns of our members were addressed in those claims. We put both offers to the members and they voted overwhelmingly to accept them. We're in a totally different situation with the RDG, and we talk about talks through the RDG. The reality is that we continue in talks with the RDG. We get to a stage whereby we think there's been some progress made. They go back to talk to their paymasters and everything unfurls in front of us. We get an offer for the RDG that bore no relationship in parts to the talks that we just concluded. The offer that was on the table is significantly different from what we settled on with Network Rail. Does Network Rail one form some sort of template? Yeah, it probably does. It's something that we could look at. There's different parts of the package that we would have to discuss with the RDG, but it does suggest a way forward, but nothing more than that.
Thank you. We'll come on to specifically negotiations with the RDG in a moment, but my final question for the moment, Mr. Whelan, you said you were zero in terms of likelihood of a settlement. Can you expand on that a little, please?
Yes, last week, late on a Friday evening, leaked to the press before we'd even had a chance to look at it or see it or open the email, was a deal that was sent out, contained many of our red lines, many things we hadn't discussed, and actually smashed the enabling agreement we have, because we don't deal with the RDG, we don't recognise the RDG. We're working through a group called the RIRG, and the three trade unions signed up to an enabling agreement with them. Part of that enabling agreement, of course, was that certain parts of the railway were excluded from severance, including signal persons, guards and drivers. Receive a deal telling me that there's going to be no compulsory redundancies till 2024. Also, the deal told us what our people would do, where we would negotiate, and broke the arrangements within the enabling agreement about how we would cascade any broad brush agreement we might have made at a national level. My board, my executive committee, will deal with that next Monday. I'm naturally being questioned all the time on what my view on that deal is. I'm incredibly open that I cannot recommend any one element of it, and it may destroy the ability to go back to those talks in future.
Okay, well, we'll delve into some of these points, and obviously we've got the other side of the table coming to us in just under an hour's time. But can I hand over to Paul? Do you want to
Thank you, Chair.
the next questions?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I don't envy anybody trying to do any these sort of negotiations right in the public domain, which you guys have to. But just in terms of, I'm going to be directing this particularly at Mr. Lynch and Mr. Ward in the first instance. I'll go to you first, Mr. Ward, if I can. But I wanted to understand why you rejected the Rail Delivery Group's initial offer. And you said that it had contained elements which had never been discussed, and then that there was it admitted significant points that had been negotiated. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? I mean, I thank you, by the way, for the submissions that we got from some of you.
I mean, driver only wasn't part of the discussions that we'd been having recently with the RDG, and the talks that we'd been having made some progress. When they came back with a formal offer in reference to driver only, it just came out of nowhere for us. So much so that I asked our negotiators, when did we start talking about this, and I was told quite categorically that we hadn't been talking about it at all.
There's been no reference at all to DO?
No, but there are things within the offer that were just totally unacceptable to us. It's a pay offer, 4% for last year and 4% for this year. As Mr Lynch has quite rightly referred, inflation for the rail industry is running at 14%. 4% will not help a lot of our lower paid members. The deal that we done with Network Rail was 5% in 2022 and 4% in 2023, but with a minimum of 1,750 for lower paid workers. There's no bottom for lower paid workers in the RDG offer. We are asked to make commitments in terms of delivering on the modernisation, as they refer to within the railway, that we will not take any industrial action between signing off the agreement and April 2024. At the same time, we're being given a commitment that there will be no compulsory redundancies before the 1st of April 2024. So they can come and propose compulsory redundancies in January 24, enact them in April 24, and we can't take any industrial action about it until after those people have been made compulsory redundant and left the industry. It's just not acceptable. And in addition to that, there were offers for Network Rail to improve terms and conditions, which we don't get anything. We don't get anything from the Rail Delivery Group in terms of terms and conditions. So there's not even a sweetener there for our members as far as that's concerned. The Network Rail no compulsory redundancy agreement ran to January 2025. Clearly, members working for train operating companies are asking why those employees in the rail industry who work for Network Rail have got no compulsory redundancy to January 25 and theirs is only April 24, and what plans their employers might have for them. So it creates a lot of uncertainty. It doesn't address the concerns in regards to pay, and there was nothing else that would sweeten it as far as our members were concerned. We consult with our representatives before we decide what to do with any offer that we get from the employer, and every single one of our representatives turned around and says this just won't wash.
So you'd be looking, not trying to put words in your mouth too much, but in terms of the structure of a deal, the way that the one you've accepted sat with a bias towards the lower paid employees getting a slightly higher percentage, that's the sort of thing that could be a step in the right direction. Is that a fair comment?
It would be a step in the right direction. What would also be a step in the right direction would be an offer for management staff and an offer for controllers.
Which you haven't received yet?
We've not received any offer for management staff and controllers, and it is notable that when we've done the deals with Network Rail, the first deal that we settled was for management staff. That was the first offer that we got, and we settled with them in that. We've not even had an offer, and we've asked repeatedly for offers for both those groups of staff, and we've been told that they don't have the authority for the DFT to make us any offer.
Okay, just coming back to the driver-only operation just for a second. You said that it was suddenly brought into the discussions at a late point. I mean, I think any casual observer of what's going on in the railways at the moment would be aware that there's pressure from government and others to come up with more driver-only operations. So I'm a little bit surprised that it was a surprise, if you see what I mean. Even if I understand what you're saying, that it doesn't seem to have been specifically looked at. Can I just ask one question on DO? Is it something that you just don't see as being feasible at all, or is it the fact that you're worried about the fact that it's being pushed too comprehensive? I noticed from some of the submissions that you talk about the cases where combining DOO with a ticketless station puts all sorts of vulnerability risks because of the two. Are there spaces where you would see that driver-only operation is still practical, though? Or is it just a no complete? I'm just trying to understand whether it's a partial stop or a full stop.
Who are you asking? Because Frank doesn't have guards in his...
I was going to
We will not accept driver-only operation in any company without fight. We'll never sign up to accepting DOO. It will never happen while I'm the General Secretary. It will never happen as long as the RMT exists. So it's not very clever in a negotiation, in my opinion. And it is the DFT that have insisted on this, not the executives that are coming in to see you. They'll have to do what they're told, because that's what the contract says. The contracts that these train operators have with the DFT says, one, that the Secretary of State is entirely responsible for their industrial mandate, their negotiating mandate. Two, he has to approve a dispute handling programme. And three, they will make no communication with the trade unions without his prior approval, including writing a business as usual letter. So if I write to any train operating company, they have to inform the DFT within 3 working days with what the contents of that letter. And that includes phone calls and discussions as well, according to the contract. So nothing happens in this industry without the Secretary of State and the 50 people in the DFT today that are working on this dispute and what they call workforce reforms. 50 people working full-time besides the politicians right now. So they insisted right at the end, and if the executives involved in this industry told you the truth, they will tell you that they knew before they put that on the table it would be rejected. And Mr. Whelan will speak on his behalf, because there's 2 sets of people on these trains. So it's just not very bright to do that. Why would you, if you're seeking a solution to a serious industrial dispute that's high profile, would you wait until a Sunday afternoon at 4 o'clock to put 9 clauses into a document which weren't in the previous version? It's daft. And to me, it's sabotage. And they wanted these strikes to go ahead. They knew that going forward with the imposition of change in Network Rail and DOO would provoke a reaction. They got the reaction. They let the strikes go ahead over Christmas. They didn't lift a telephone or lift a finger to get them off. They brought forward stage-managed releases in the last week about minimum service levels, about disruption and all the rest of it, about me and various other people in the industry, all primed through certain press outlets. And the whole thing has been completely stage-managed leading up till Monday's sessions with the trade unions, as far as I can see. So it's a deliberate torpedoing of the talks which could have developed. That's why DOO was in there, not because it would have helped resolve the dispute.
Okay, I'm going to try and stick to the question that I asked in the first place, which is about DOO, because I know that my colleagues are going to come back round in discussions and questions about the specific of government intervention or not, and you have the opportunity to go through that in a little bit more detail then. So really, you're saying there's absolutely no way that any train will run with DOO?
We will never accept that we introduce the removal of more guards from trains. No, we won't accept that. And we won't continue with any talks that has that as a prerequisite.
I'll leave that one there, Chair.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. Jack.
Thank you, Chair. And
sorry, Mick, I should have come.
Sorry, Chair, would you like to know the view of the Train Drivers Union on driver-only operation?
My apologies. Yes.
No, I don't want to cut across you if you didn't want to know. Quite simply, I've given evidence to this body before on the Southern dispute. Our position remains the same. The train drivers who do it hate it, feel it's unsafe. We believe it's inherently unsafe. Prior to the pandemic, the whole industry was moving in a different direction. All the travelling public, all passenger focused, and everybody wanted visible presence and a safe presence in every train. We've seen sexual assaults in our railway increase by 180%. We had county lines and drugs. We had areas where people were refusing to move without security guards on trains at certain times of night. Unfortunately, society hasn't got more polite, it hasn't got more safer. And since then, also the Rail Safety and Standards Board has designated that train drivers are lone workers. So every role has to be re-evaluated in light of us being those lone workers. So where there is no staff on stations, where there's nobody in booking offices, and where there's nobody on trains, right, we do not believe it's a safe railway for the travelling public. But also, we do believe that you need everybody in all those positions to run a safe railway, and we will not be supporting DOO if it comes forward as part of this deal or any future deal in future.
Thank you. I'll come to you, Jack, just in a second.
Yes,
I've got one quick question. Is there a difference from your perspective from driver-only operated and driver-controlled operated, i.e. there is another person on the train, they might not be opening and shutting the doors?
No. It's about dispatch. It's about our Victorian infrastructure. It's about DOO was delivered at a time when we had 3-car trains and you dropped the window light on the side and you could see back along the length of the train. It wasn't designed for 12 and 13-car trains with 1,300 people on and one body to protect them. And if that one body gets injured or has a medical incident, there is nobody to look after the travelling public. That was not what DOO was designed for. Also, DOO initially was in intensive urban areas where there was a station every couple of minutes. Modern proposals are for DOO everywhere, where maybe 27, 30 minutes or even an hour between stations, where anything can happen to the travelling public and there is no protection. And we cannot support that.
I want to come to Jack, but
that's just a slightly different position that's been taken there, Chair. I just wanted to just come back on that just slightly.
Quickly, because
just in the sense that, you know, you're saying that it's not appropriate for, you know, the long big trains, but the little ones is where it was introduced in the first place. Is there therefore not still a window for some use in certain environments? That's okay.
I don't believe so. I think the real problem with the nature of modern society and the dangers to the travelling public and to the staff on the railway preclude anybody from working alone.
Okay, thank you, Jack.
Thank you, Chair. And my questions are mainly to Mr. Whelan. And first, around an offer on paying conditions. Have you received an offer from RDG?
Well, the first I knew was when my media person rang me up and said, "What do you say about the offer?" If I can go slightly backwards to explain the chronology, it might assist. I'd been approached by Mr. Montgomery, who you're going to speak to later, the Friday of Christmas week, saying, "Can we meet next week?" I'd met Mr. Harper and Mr. Merriman prior to that, and they said they were going to put Mr. Merriman in to facilitate the talks, and we were awaiting that meeting before we went into further talks, because we thought that was due decorum and we needed to understand the role of the Rail Minister in the facilitation of the talks. But also pointing out that at a point in time that, unfortunately, like anybody else, my negotiating team has a right to take leave, and we had no availability. 2 of the 3, and I'm one of the team, were out of the country and not available, and we couldn't have met anyway. I then, not surprisingly, very quickly received an email from the Rail Minister's Department saying, could we meet? And we met on Monday, which was the first available slot, for the same reason that I gave to the negotiators of the RIRG. So, to my surprise, I did have a text from Mr. Montgomery on the Friday morning, and he was on my list of people to ring back when I finished my other things I had to do that day. Could we talk? But my first knowledge of the deal that contained so many red lines and so many things we hadn't discussed was when we were being asked by the press our view on the deal. I went back through my emails later, after having said I hadn't said the deal, to find out that I had been sent an email at 15:18.
So in terms
and then
of
the press release went out 20 minutes later.
So in terms of the deal that you've been offered, which aspects of that are acceptable to your members and which aspects are not?
There is not one line in that deal, from the opening comments to the final full stop, that I could recommend, because the deal basically says that we rip up every agreement we have, local and national, forever and a day, have no right to negotiate in future, and it'll be forced upon our members in the talks, which was not what we agreed within the enabling agreement. What we agreed as joint trade unions in the enabling agreement, that we would agree at a high level things be passed down to our 15 negotiating groups on the talks, and then they would then negotiate separately on those items if they could. And if they could then make a recommendation, we would then put that to our members in those different companies. Part of the difficulty we have is there isn't a one-size-fits-all deal. I've got companies, because of the fractionalisation of the railway and the cutting and carving up of the map, I've got 3 sets of drivers on different conditions in one company. So every deal and every aspect of a deal may impact upon those terms and conditions and the ability to do a deal in a different way.
So what would you like to see in a deal to make it so that it would be near to something that you would accept?
I think we're very much getting to the point whereby after 4 years without a pay offer, a significant pay offer, that we need a clean pay offer to move forward, to get out of the current strife that we're in, to go back to the table clean, to look it forward. Most of what's contained in that deal, there's no modernisation in that deal, there is no reform. It is basically a productivity grab. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds of productivity for nothing, for a 20% cut in pay. And strange enough, I do see the role of trade unions to protect the standards of living of the people they represent.
Do you recognise that there is a need to modernise certain terms and conditions?
And in the areas where we have to modernise, I think I'm the person that signed off ATO under St Pancras. I think both my colleagues have made public statements about where we've facilitated modernisation before. There hasn't been a major project in the UK in the last 23 years that hasn't happened without the buy-in and the willingness of the trade unions. We want to grow railways. I don't want my people dying because there's no toilets on trains and using tenant products. I don't want my people using semaphore signals and going to 2 colour lights, 3 colour lights, and then ATO. I actually want a green railways at the centre of a green revolution, that we decarbonise and we deliver Kyoto, Paris and whatever. What we're currently seeing, unfortunately, isn't modernisation. It's a pure productivity grab of a wish list of all the things that various companies couldn't achieve in the last 2.5 decades, because in many occasions they couldn't afford them, unfortunately.
In terms of pay increases, given that the average driver salary is more or less double the average salary in my constituency, would you expect that it's right for my constituents to have to pay more to fund these increases to driver salaries?
I find it rather intriguing, because we don't work for the DfT. We don't work for the Treasury, we don't work for the government. I've got 15 different disputes with 15 train operating companies who are declaring profits and paying dividends. In any other economic organisation, you would do your fixed costs, including pay first, before you declared any dividends or any profits. And I look around the industry and I see the high profits of the Roscoes and venture capitalists. It seems very much to me that we find ourselves in a very Monty Python-esque world, whereby you now want the funders to fund the profits of the shareholders to keep the private interest within the industry itself, and that isn't going to happen.
I don't think you've answered that question, but anyway, in terms of driver salaries, do you not think that drivers are already relatively well paid?
No.
Okay.
And if I can explain why.
What would you consider to be a fair pay then, in terms
Well, if drivers were on whatever salary they were within the range 4 years ago, I'd like at least nice to see them stand still. You know,
what sort of figure would you like?
We haven't put a figure on it. We deliberately haven't, because that was also part of the enabling agreement, that it would go down to the various companies to be discussed. Because a one-size-fits-all solution, you could only do a broad brush range of things for people to discuss that would facilitate a deal going forward. Now, we've never put a price on it, and ultimately the opportunity cost of either the productivity or the high cost of living will be determined by the people who vote on the deal.
You're trying to negotiate when you don't even have a figure of how much you want to accept.
I may have a figure in my head, but in negotiation...
You're not share it with us today.
I haven't shared it with the media, haven't shared it with anybody in the last 12 months or more. We're waiting to see what can be achieved in the negotiations we have and actually what people are putting on the table. But what was thrown out to the press last week and sent to us by email wasn't even part of the discussions that we'd had. And where it had been part of discussions, many of them had been red lines. So again, echoing what Mr Lynch said, people deliberately scuppered any chance of a deal by putting out things that had already been declined.
Thank you, Chair.
Chris.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, gentlemen. I'd like to start with Mr Whelan, if I may. Mick, can you just tell us, are you a member of the Labour Party's Executive Committee?
I am.
Could you also confirm if you are chairman of the Labour Party group of affiliated trade unions, otherwise known as TULO?
It's my proud privilege to be the chair of the Labour affiliated trade unions. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you receive any direction from the Labour Party in these discussions or negotiations?
Excuse me for laughing. Unfortunately, no. I've had no discussions with anybody. We have briefed people in the shadow cabinet on our position as a trade union, but there has been no direct discussion or policy in relation to this dispute coming from the leadership of the Labour Party. And I think it's a matter of public record, my view on MPs and others attending picket lines.
Thank you very much.
Which is in direct opposition to my leader at this moment in time.
Yeah, thank you. I understand that the RMT has attended 4 meetings with the department and or the minister. Could you just tell us how many meetings you've attended, please?
With which minister? I've had 3 in a month.
Well, the minister, one of the ministers for transport. How many meetings have you had with the department for transport?
In recent times, never met Mr. Shapps in person. Dealt with him.
I'm sorry,
I'm trying to work it out for you.
the
Sorry,
DFT.
bear with me.
Is it the
I've
unfortunate
never met Mr. Shapps in person. Had one meet and greet with Anne-Marie Trevelyan. Unfortunately, she wasn't there very long. Met Mr. Harper for the first time once before Christmas, and I've met Mr. Merriman, the Rail Minister, twice. Once with Mr. Harper before Christmas, and once to the meeting I alluded to earlier this Monday.
Okay, so you've met DFT twice.
I haven't met the DFT at all.
Well, ministers of the DFT.
I've met the ministers for. The question was, had I met the DFT? I have not met the DFT in any capacity.
Okay.
There have been members of the DFT writing down every word I say when I go into these meetings with the ministers, but they haven't spoken, they haven't contributed, they haven't asked any questions, and we haven't had any dialogue with them, if that's your question.
Yeah, thank you. Could you just tell us what's the best offer that you've received so far from the RDG in respect of a TOG?
The only offer we received in 4 years was the one that was leaked to the press last Friday.
So I understand that ASLEF refused an offer from Merseyrail of a 19% pay offer. Could you just tell us why that was?
We've done a deal on Merseyrail. I don't recollect a 90% offer.
So 19% over 2 years, I understand?
Right, so we've done a deal with Merseyrail, so we've accepted the deal's gone out to ballot. We're waiting for the result of that ballot, so we've recommended that deal to our members.
Yeah, okay, so in which case you have accepted an offer?
I think sometimes people don't understand how trade unions work, and you've been a member of 2 of the rail unions, so you know that when an offer is made, it goes to the people that have to actually do the conditions, whatever, and they decide whether it's acceptable or not. So we have a member-driven policy that we don't put any deal out that we can't recommend.
Yeah.
If we can recommend a deal, we put it to the people that have to do it, and then they tell us whether it's viable or not.
I see. So that has been that deal has been done, and you have agreed that offer for Merseyrail.
I think the result comes in next week,
Okay.
to my knowledge. But if that's incorrect, I will come back to you.
That's all right. And that's the only operator. That's the only operator you've accepted an offer from.
No, we've done deals. We've currently done deals in Hull trains. Okay. Quite obviously, because it's a Westminster problem, we've done deals in Wales and Scotland.
Yep.
And we had a number of long-standing multi-year deals in place. We've done deals with Crossrail.
Yep. Thank you.
So we have done deals.
Could you just tell us? Are you in dispute with any freight operators?
Yes.
That's which ones?
Sorry, we represent all the freight operators.
I know, but I mean, they're separate companies.
Yeah.
So as far as I
And most
understand,
of the freight
they're not
operators
part
we've
of-
had above RPI offers with no strings.
Yeah. Have you accepted any?
I would have to go back. In the last couple of years, we have done deals with various freight operators. The actual content of those deals I can provide to the committee subsequently. No problem.
We'd be grateful for that. But currently, you're not in dispute with any of the freight operators?
No.
No. Okay, that's fine. Thank you very much. Frank, could I come to you next, please? Band 1 to 4, Management Band 1 to 4 of Network Rail, you collectively represent. Could you just tell us what the highest salary is within that band that you collectively bargain for on behalf of them?
No, I would have to come back to you in writing on that.
I understand that highest salary to be £190,000.
That may well be the case. I mean, there are people...
So could you just repeat that? I couldn't hear.
That may well be the case, but I would have to go and check it and come back to you. I mean, there are people in Network Rail that are paid more than that as well, out with bands 1 to 4. The CEO is paid, over £500,000.
Yeah. And could you just confirm, you accepted or came out of a dispute quite early on with that management band, didn't you?
Yeah, we did.
Yeah. Could you just tell us why that was?
Our management members voted to take industrial action, first time ever in my recollection. And ultimately, when we started talking, we got an offer. As is our normal practice, we put the offer to the representatives who believed that it was worthy of going to the members. We put it to the members, and the members voted overwhelmingly to accept it.
Yeah.
That's why we came out of dispute.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Mick Whelan, can I just come back to you one final question? In October last year, we understand it that the general secretaries of a number of trade unions, as well as members of the shadow cabinet, attended a fully funded visit by the TUC to go to Spain to meet your counterparts there to discuss the sorts of issues you face and to, in effect, get hints and tips. Would you just confirm for us whether or not you joined that visit, or any representative of ASLEF joined that visit?
No representative of ASLEF was on that visit.
Thank you very much. Mick Lynch, could I come to you next,
certainly.
briefly? In December, Network Rail put an offer, I think, to you on behalf of your members of 9% over 2 years, with a minimum...
3 years. You get anything last year?
Okay, thank you. With a minimum of a £1,750 value for 2022. Am I right in saying that those who were paid under 35,000 would have in effect had a better offer than that because of the minimum threshold?
Yeah, there's what we call an underpin, which is RMT's policy that there should always be an underpin or some mechanism that advances the lower paid, because continued percentage increases give them, over an evolving period, a worse deal. So that's something we're seeking from all employers and have been successful in over 20 years or more in improving lower paid wages. But it's not an offer of pay, it's an offer of, as the DFT calls it, reform and modernisation. It's a package deal, so it's conditional on accepting major changes to a whole range of things.
Would you be willing to share with us the details of what that offer has been so we can see it?
Yes, it's in the public domain, I think. It's been put on, it's on the Network Rail website, it's on our website, it's sent to all our members. I think it's broadly available. It's quite a long document. There's a document with it called Modernising Maintenance. There's some elements for signallers and others, and station grades as well.
Would you just confirm to us why the RMT only gave a period of 6 days for the referendum of the last offer rather than the standard 14 days that you would typically do?
Well, we don't have a standard. We arrange the referendums in the way that suits the needs of the dispute. So what was happening in Network Rail at that time was the commencement of the change that we hadn't agreed. So they told us that they were due to go to what local consultation or second level consultation on the changes, which would mean the actual rearrangement of the teams and the cuts to the jobs that they want to bring in, and the initiation of...
Come back to the specific,
so that's why, well, that is the specific. We needed to get the referendum result in before those changes happened. So the clock was set ticking by the company. They said to us, we're going to implement these changes from the 15th of December. So we needed an answer as to whether it was found acceptable before that happened.
I understand on the 6th of December an increasing number of groups of members of the RMT broke the strike. Could you just tell us what percentage of members did actually break the strike on those days?
We don't have a report of any increase in people breaking the strike. We know that, as you've just heard from the TSSA, that the managers and Unite and the white collar and supervisory staff have gone back to work, so they're not on strike. They've been on strike with us previously. Our picket lines are solid. The action that we have taken has had the same effects as it has on day one as it is having in the last week or so.
Are there any final points you'd like to just share with us in terms of your current negotiating position with Network Rail?
Well, we continue to talk to Network Rail, and it will continue to be a challenge. You're going to hear from Tim Shoveler. I spoke to him yesterday afternoon. We were always talking to these companies to try and work up solutions to the problems that we've jointly got. And we'll continue to do that, but it remains a challenge. The demands that have been made on us are very difficult for us to accommodate, and ultimately we feel those demands and the inflation rate means that our members' work is being undervalued by vast amounts. But that is a deliberate policy of the government in this country at the time to lower wages of working people right across the spectrum, especially where they have an influence, to make them poorer than they used to be. And I think that's a direct result of government policy.
Chairman, back to you.
Okay, thank you. Gavin.
Thanks so much, Chair. I probably should declare before I start I'm unencumbered by entreaties from the Labour front bench and was proud to support the workers at Glasgow Central last week. But we move on to the role of government in the dispute. And bizarrely, during the dispute we've had 3 entirely different ministerial teams at the DFT. I wonder, and I'll start with you, Mr. Whelan, what role the government, or what role each of those teams have played in the dispute thus far, and what difference there has been between the approach of the three teams, if I could.
I think there's been a constant interference in the free collective bargaining process by all the teams. Increasingly there seems to be a generation of bad faith driven from behind the scenes. We've seen that in what happened with putting clauses into the RMT deal that hadn't been discussed, and I believe the leaking of the deal and putting the deal out to us last week. I don't believe that's been done without any discussion, because as we know, anything can come out. Discussion has to happen with the DFT and the relevant minister. So everything that's happening is, we believe, currently government driven. And we have no way of affecting that.
Has there been any improvement with the new ministerial team compared to the previous 2 iterations?
We've had an offer from Mr Harper that Mr Merriman will help facilitate future talks. Unfortunately, that's been scuppered by what happened last Friday, because at this moment in time there is no future talks for him to facilitate. We would hope there would have been an ownership role within those talks. I think Mr Merriman made it quite clear that he was just there to facilitate meetings and how it would work in future. We live in hope that it will help.
Mr Ward, same question to you in terms of the different approach of...
Mr Sharp's was non-existent as far as we were concerned. We foresaw difficulties with our 2022 pay claim as early as December 21. We submitted claims to the majority of the employers and get no responses whatsoever. We repeatedly contacted the employers asking for meetings, get very little movement from the employers on that. We wrote on a number of occasions to Mr Sharps and asked him if he could use his influence to engage the employers before we went into dispute, get no responses whatsoever. So as far as we're concerned, it just wasn't there. Miss Trevelyan wasn't there really long enough to make a difference, to be honest, in this. And to be honest, the dispute almost went into hibernation during the leadership, the Tory leadership campaign. So that's just not worth there. Much more comment on that. The current team is slightly different. They engage. We've had a number of meetings with either the Secretary of State or with the Rail Minister. They continually offer to use their offices to try and facilitate an agreement. However, the evidence that we get from the RDG in particular is that they cannot make any agreement without sign off from the DFT and the government ministers. And consequently, any time we make any progress, it goes back and then it comes back and it's changed again.
Yeah, Mr Lynch.
Yeah, so I believe this whole situation, the dispute and all the elements of it have been conceived in the DFT, going back to when Mr Heaton Harris was the rail minister under Mr Shapps. So this is Mr Shapps' project, if you like, and this dispute is his bequest to the rest of us. So we've all got to deal with it. And I believe he's still involved quite heavily. When the documents go round Whitehall, I think there's a steer from the business department, and that's fine. But Mr Harper and Mr Merriman are very pleasant to deal with. They're a much better relationship. I think we'd all say that. on a one-to-one and dealing with, even, I'm sure, with the employers, it's a much better relationship. But I always say it's about product. The template has been set by previous administrations in the DFT, and there is a strong hand of the Treasury on top of all of that about what's going on. And they say to us directly that we cannot move very far on this, the merits of your own dispute, because what it will say about health, education and every other public servant that we've got involved with all the issues going on now. But it is, you can tell it is, because in ScotRail we've made a settlement. In Transport for Wales we've all made settlements. Merseyrail, which is outside their bounds, settlements. Tyne and Wear Metro, outside the DFT, settlements. London Transport, settlements. Everywhere where the DFT's hand is not the control on the tiller, we have made settlements in this industry, and we've made them in the private sector. As far as I'm concerned, we still deal with private engineering companies, even cleaning contractors, bus companies, ferry companies, all sorts of people in transport make settlements with our unions, apart from those ones directly controlled by the DFT, and it's in the contract. The service contract that they have with the Department for Transport gives to the Secretary of State ultimate power in the negotiating room, even though he's not there. So the entire project is a conception of the DFT. And
that leads me on quite well to, you said previously to the committee that Scottish Government or Scottish politicians essentially, it's your impression that they want to resolve the issue, and obviously since then issues have been resolved, but politicians down here want to exacerbate the issue. I wonder if you could maybe elaborate on that, but with any sort of specifics regard to some of the issues at play, whether it's driver-only operation or whether it's Sunday working practices or no compulsory redundancies, etc. What's your take on a different approach? And that obviously applies to Wales and what have you as well.
Yeah, and I think it's true in the devolved authorities in Merseyside and those other areas as well, and London. They do want to find solutions, and I think what we get from the DFT is provocations in language, and also what is put into the documents. But you can also see it the way that they run the railway. When there's a Network Rail strike, they shut Scotland, and they shut large parts of Wales, and they choose to run the parts that connect to England. It's quite cynical in my view, the way they work it. And I know, because I've met the Scottish transport ministers, and we engage with senior people in transport portfolio, I think it's called in the Welsh Government, that they are seething about the way they're treated. They don't get an input into what is a GB-wide infrastructure that we all need to connect up our communities and our economies, and they get no say whatsoever from the DFT. It's not a partnership arrangement between the transport ministers or portfolio holders, and we know that the northern mayors are absolutely seething about the transport services they get on non-strike days and strike days. And it seems to me that there is almost a Stalinist obsession, can I say it, in the DFT about central control, and you can see that in the contracts. British Rail would never have tolerated the amount of interference from the Secretary of State. The chairman of British Rail would have been told to get on with running that business and be accountable to bodies like this, and the Minister, of course, and to Parliament, but on a report-back basis, not an interference basis. The DFT is not allowing the Scottish and Welsh authorities to have any influence on this dispute, even though they are completely affected by it.
Sure. And as I for TSA get anything, or TSSA get anything to add to that? I'm conscious I need to move on to minimum service levels.
I mean, I think we've seen the massive briefing process that's gone on through the media and elsewhere, and it can only be happening from the Ministry and the DFT. And every time that happens, it hampers any ability to realistically sit down in good conscience and try and find a way forward.
So to move on to the introduction yesterday of the minimum service levels legislation, given the point that Mr Lynch just made about essentially the point I made yesterday in the Chamber as well, that if Anti-West Coast and Transpennine can barely deliver minimum service levels at the best of times at the moment, it's quite something. But what's your take, what's the ASLEF's take to this legislation as it stands?
Quite naturally, we have an antipathy towards it. We will seek to see what legal avenues we can take to challenge it. It won't solve the current dispute because by the time it comes through Parliament, goes through the Lords and becomes law, and then the various activities associated with it from all the different companies sitting down and agreeing on separate levels, we're an awful long way away from actually having any current impact. What it does do is exacerbate the current situation, but also I don't see how it can operate safely. I remember when there was a National Fire Brigade dispute, we came to as an industry and said we had to run the whole railway as we did normally, otherwise it'd be unsafe. So if you're talking about running the railway partially, you've already decided nationally that it'd be unsafe to do so. We await events.
TSSA?
Well, I heard the Minister selling it across all the airwaves yesterday as a safety measure. I would invite the committee to ask the Transport Minister if he's had any safety concerns during the process of this dispute that would cause him to believe that such legislation is actually necessary.
Okay, and Mr Lynch?
Well, it tickles me that they will put non-qualified people into signal boxes to break strikes, and they'll have safety incidents, which they have every time they have a strike, when managers break the rules and break their competency basis. But it's the unions that are endangering safety. It's the attempt to break the strikes that imports more danger than anything else. And it's an infringement of civil liberties. The right to strike is something that any democratic society will have. If they want to run the signalling system on Network Rail during a dispute in the way that they will, they'll have to get all the signallers to work, and they will command them and conscript them to work. If they were doing that in Putin's Russia or in Iran or China, they would rightly be condemned. Conscripting workers to go to work against their will is an outrage, and that's what this legislation will bring forward, that either we will name them, or the companies will name them, or even the Secretary of State may name individuals that have to go to work on strike days. How that is democratic and free in a free society, I don't understand, and we'll have to challenge it in every way that we can, and it'll have to be repealed as soon as there's a change in government.
And very brief, quick last question, before we move on to the last question. If you were to have the Secretary of State in front of you or the Rail Minister, what is the one thing you need from them to advance this situation?
I think we've been consistent in saying that it's only the government and the Rail Minister that can take the shackles off the employers in the negotiations. I previously reported to you that we were stunned when we found out that our employers had signed a deal with the government where they couldn't offer more than 2% in pay. We never even got offered the 2% in the last 4 years. Constricting free collective bargaining and then indenturing people if they dare to have a voice in it later on is a very difficult direction for any society.
And do you differ from that view, or
No, not really.
no, the same? Okay, thanks.
The employers need to be free to negotiate. At this moment they're not.
We may well be asking them that in the next panel.
We'll probably move on to those questions, but Mike, you want to come in on this point too?
Yes, to Frank first, Frank Ward first. You recently accused the Secretary of State, and I quote, of actively blocking any improvements to a possible deal. Why do you think this Tory government would actively block any improvements to a possible deal?
Mr Lynch said earlier, I think it's something they've inherited from a previous Secretary of State for Transport. This is an agenda that's been pursued by the government, and it's very much anti-trade union, and we've seen the evidence of that yesterday. I think they've been looking for particular disputes that they could hang this particular legislation on, and it's been encouraged over the last 9 months. We've gradually worked towards the situation that we find ourselves in now.
Thank you. And same really to Mick Whelan and Mick Lynch. Do you feel they're blocking the deal, and what are the motives?
Yeah, I think they have dictated what the companies say. I don't think they can even deny that. It's there in law. It's in the contract. So, but they've got themselves stuck. They thought that the public would hate the trade unions. They thought this would all go away in June. And instead, the reverse has happened, that more unions have joined into campaigns against poverty. And where this is a campaign to drive poverty into our communities, I believe. So last week, and in the run-up to Christmas, I think the whole thing has been choreographed and stage managed so that the action went ahead, so that these announcements could be made according to a timetable starting with Mr Sunak on Tuesday, I think, and then the announcements of these draconian anti-trade union laws this week, and ending with the choreographed sessions on Monday. So the whole thing has been pre-arranged. It's almost as if there's been some kind of stage director running this dispute. That's why we couldn't make any progress before Christmas, even though I know the companies wanted to. They wanted to come to us with developed proposals, and they were not allowed to by the Department for Transport. And if anyone says that's not the case, they are not telling you the truth. And I'll put that on the record. They have stopped the development of proposals deliberately at every stage in this dispute. And every time we make a suggestion, they have to go and ask the DFT, the 50 people that are working on this, whether they can make a change to the text or indeed the principles of the proposals. And it takes weeks every time.
And yourself, mate.
It's quite obvious from the chronology of what's occurred. I echo mixed sentiments, but quite simply, our employers know how the rail unions operate. They know that we here are just the faces of the trade unions. We have executive committees and boards who then decide whether things are viable or whether they go to our members. And the very activity of leaking a deal to the press last Friday, before they had the opportunity for it to be properly considered by the trade union to articulate a response back to the industry, they knew exactly what they were doing, and they must have been doing it on the behest of somebody else. Otherwise, why were they set up to fail?
Singling out the DFT, essentially the Secretary of State, yes, it's hardwired into the system, isn't it, process? The book lies with them. What's the motivation? What do they need to do to ensure that actually there's a compromise, there's a win-win solution, there's a resolution to this dispute? What steps do they need to take? And why on earth are they driving it? What's the motivation? Your assessment?
Well, it's not. They're not free actors themselves, the DFT. The Treasury has always run this dispute, whether it's been Mr Sunak in his previous incarnation, and the spending limits and all the rest of it. They decided to defund the railway by 2 billion, plus 2 billion in London Transport, and we've got loads of problems over there that have been slightly hidden by the national dispute. But the defunding of the railway system in general is at the bottom of this, and there's an attempt to defund a lot of services, I believe, and that's what is at the heart of all of the public sector disputes at the moment. They're not funded properly, and people aren't paid properly. People are getting poorer every week. But that is a deliberate policy to transfer wealth, I believe, from working people to people who have got money already. It's all part of a game that's being played in front of us, and this is how it plays out in detail. That's their motivation.
Frank?
I've nothing to add beyond what I said earlier. I think the whole thing's been choreographed in order to allow what happened yesterday, for the business secretary to stand up and say we're going to crack down on trade unions. That's the motivation.
It does appear ideological. I hear stories from the government about wanting skilled, high-paid workers, and then their activities across all sectors, not just the rail sector, actually seem to want to challenge vocational people or people with skills and keep them down. The fact that we hadn't had a pay rise for 4 years, we weren't seeking a pay rise for the 2 years of the pandemic. We only went to Mr Heaton Harris when inflation started going through the roof and when it hit 5.2. Now, if our members were demanding a pay rise, not having had one for the previous 2 years when inflation was 5.2, how do you feel when they find last year inflation going to 14% and in massive double digits and possibly going higher than 14% this year? The idea that 4% and 4% for every condition that we've ever had, because that's what the current deal does, right? A 20% pay cut in real terms, right, for no future and no say in what you can do in the future. How could any trade union sell that to anybody they represent? I don't understand it.
Yes. Thank you, gentlemen.
Okay. Greg.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. Can I ask you all, from the answers you've given so far, it doesn't seem that there is an end in sight for this particular dispute. So if we just take that as read, How much longer can you, your members, the entities that are your respective unions, financially sustain this dispute?
I've said it repeatedly, we're in it for the long haul. Our members will do this because it's their futures for as long as it takes. I rather flippantly said in the press the other day I'd like to see it resolved before I retire. I'm going in 3 years' time. I'd like to resolve it tomorrow, quite honestly. Our people don't want to be losing picket lines, they don't want to be on strike, and I'd rather go back to doing my day job of trying to rebuild this industry rather than where we are now. But when people want to take away everything that you may have generated over 140 years in one fell swoop, right, and pay you less than you were getting 3 or 4 years ago for it, why would they sign up to that? It's not going to happen, is it?
But specifically to my question, I understand everything you've said.
We could financially sustain this for an awful long time.
And your members?
And our members.
Mr. Ward?
I mean, respectfully, I would probably turn the question on its head and ask how long do you think the DFT can afford to financially sustain the losses that the train operating companies in particular will be incurring as a consequence of this, which they are contractually bound to do, given their hand in actually managing these disputes. As far as our members are concerned, at some point in the near future we're going to be balloting our members, and they'll tell us at that point in time how long they're willing to continue with this, but it's really down to our members. At this moment in time, they seem to have the backbone to continue with this for a long time if necessary. We've had some members out in as many as 9 days straight as a consequence of this dispute, so they are suffering in their pay pocket, and some of them are low paid workers. We hear a lot about train driver salaries and some manager salaries being up at £190,000 and that. The brunt of the changes which have been brought into this industry are going to force down on the lower paid workers. The booking offices are going to close across the country. A lot of those employees are getting paid at around £20,000 a year. A 4% pay offer to them is less than £20 a week as an increase. 4% to someone who's on 200,000 or even £500,000 in the case of Network Rail makes a big difference to them. But £20 a week isn't going to help a lot of our members to address the financial uncertainty that they're facing at this moment in time. But they've still got the backbone to stand up there and say we're not putting up with it anymore.
Okay, I'm going to come back on one point you made to all three of you in a minute, but Mr. Lynch, just on that first question.
Yeah, well, our members have reballoted, all the members, 43,000, and they voted for a further 6 months mandate. We don't want to exercise that mandate. We are looking to develop a settlement, and they will decide ultimately through a referendum vote whether whatever is the final resolution to the dispute. We don't finance our members. We give them some dispute payments, which is money that's collected. They don't get strike pay, so they finance it themselves. So they will make their decisions, but at the moment, our action is having the same effect as it did on day one. And we will consider, once we've had the discussions with the government on Monday, we will have the discussions with the companies, and we go to our people and have mass meetings of reps all of the time. So we met 400 reps last week, immediately after the action, and we will meet them again when we get more proposals. So it's not just a diktat. They decide, in effect, through their elected people, the pursuit of the dispute, what action we should take, when we should take a pause, when we should go back to it, when we should have a referendum. So it will be sustained as long as they want it to be sustained.
Okay, so let's just take as a possibility that 6 month mandate goes 6 months. Maybe there's a fresh ballot, maybe it goes longer than that. How much damage do you think from the existing industrial action and potential future industrial action is being done to the railways in the most generic sense, full stop? We know that COVID brought massive damage and that it fundamentally changed habits of customers, of passengers. We're seeing a lot fewer rush hour use, more social use, more weekend use of the railways post-COVID. Add in uncertainty on the part of consumers as to whether the train will even be running because of industrial action. How much damage has been done to the railway, particularly from consumer choice, which then plays to Mr. Ward's point about losses to the operating companies as a result, not just from industrial action but from changed habits? How much damage has actually been done to the railway?
Loads of damage has been done, but as I say, the damage is conceived and controlled in the Department for Transport. This is their project. They knew that there would be an industrial response from the trade unions. They decided to make what they would think is a great leap forward and provoke the workforce and attack the workforce. So the damage has been envisaged in Whitehall by people who know very little about the railway. Rather than trying to get consent and evolution of the railway, they went for this great leap forward, and it's blown up in their faces. So the damage is being conceived by this administration, and they are inflicting the damage. They have also brought forward a set of legislation that they quickly abandoned on the future structure of the railway. Maybe they'll come back to that, I don't know. Maybe there'll be a new transport minister that'll have another idea. So the damage is being caused by the inconsistent and reckless policy of the people that are in control of the railway, which is the current administration. It's not being caused by the workforce, who are prepared to work through change that is considered and agreed rather than imposed.
I understand. You won't expect me to agree with it, but you'll understand.
Well, most people do agree with it. Most people think our rails are in a terrible state and that government policy is useless.
Let me put this into a question. I understand the perspective you're coming from, but surely you must agree that by making the railway uncertain in its operation from the eyes of the consumer, the people who pay a lot of money.
You're talking about when we're on strike and when we're not on strike?
When you're on strike.
What about the days when we're not on strike, when it's absolutely useless as well?
That's a whole other evidence session.
No, it's not. So since the timetable change that came a couple of years ago, the whole thing's been a disaster.
The question is, you must accept that people are being driven away from the railway because of the uncertainty of knowing whether it's running, because whether it's on strike or not, people are going back to their cars, they are going to coaches, they are just not travelling. We've seen the evidence from UK hospitality that the hospitality sector took an absolute bath in December when they're meant to, because people couldn't get into predominantly London.
It's not a question, is it? But I think it's your government's fault, is my answer when you get there.
Driving people away from the railway?
No, you are. Your government. Right,
okay. Mr. Ward.
Oh, I mean, clearly, if there's uncertainty about this, the service, it will drive people away. There's always been uncertainty about the service in the railway in recent years for different reasons. But Mr Lynch is right. It's the policies of this government that are creating that uncertainty. This dispute is being prosecuted by the Department of Transport. They're making this happen. If they took their hands off the tiller as far as the employers are concerned and allowed them to negotiate with good faith, we could find resolutions to this. They won't do that. And the employers can't negotiate with us in good faith, because any attempt on their part to do so will effectively mean that they won't be compensated for the loss of revenue or for the loss of profits that they're going to, or the fallen profits that they're going to sustain going forward. I also think it's notable actually that despite the fact that we've come through COVID with all the emergency arrangements, agreements that were put in place, that all of the companies that were under that managed to make profits, managed to pay dividends to their shareholders, never gave pay increases to their workers, and now we're in a situation whereby government are saying we've got to cut back the expenditure on the railway. The answer is let's get the workers to pay for it. This is political, this is not industrial.
To the question though, the more the railway is not operational because of industrial action, the less people are going to choose to use the railways even when there is not industrial action, which is going to fundamentally undermine the entire future of the railway, is it not?
Absolutely, and that seems to be government policy.
Mr Whelan.
I'm going to echo what my colleagues say. I hope to say in a slightly different way, not to bore you all. I'm quite sure we were the stakeholders that campaigned against the RPI increase in fares last year. We're the ones who've They said that we don't want the truncated timetables that are not serving the northwest and northeast, where some people are only getting one train a day. And we've tried to work within the changing nature of the industry, because it's a 7-day, 24-hour day industry, it always has been. But we had seen footfall coming back. We had seen demands even from government departments, particularly Jacob Rees-Mogg, that people don't work from home, and we've seen more and more companies feeling that that wasn't effectively given the productivity they wanted. So we've seen a growth in leisure travel, and we've seen a drift back post-COVID in normal traffic. But basically the railway itself, because of how it's currently operating, sustaining on a daily basis, isn't attractive. And of course we're going to go into next January where there's going to be a further 5% increase in fares, where we'll see a further increase in what we call transport poverty and people's ability to afford to travel on our railways. So, but is the choice for a trade union when your employer and the government deliberately causes a dispute not to react and to do nothing? This was a fully expected political and industrial reaction from the bad actors who set this up in the first place. The companies decided to sign the new contracts in the post-pandemic world knew exactly what they were doing, knew how we organised, how we bargained with them for the last 2.5 decades. The government, in doing what they did, knew that there was going to be a reaction from the trade unions. I think what they didn't expect was us still to be here 6 or 8 months on. But for many people in this industry, this is existential. And thank you.
Okay, thank you. Jack, you wanted to have a supplementary and then come to Ben for the last
Thank you, Chair.
section.
This is to what Mr Lynch said a few moments ago around reduction of funding to the railways. You just suggested around 2 million. NAO figures show that the amount of government funding to the railways has actually doubled since 2015-16 to 2019-20. So where do you get your figures from?
I get it from the employers. They told me they've been asked to reduce their costs by 2 billion. I get it from the London Mayor, when I go and meet him and the Commissioner for London Transport, says I've been told to reduce my budget by 2 billion. That's what the savings are for. You've increased the funding. It doesn't go to our people. It goes to these private sector operators and to Network Rail. We don't get all the money. The pay bill in the railway industry is quite modest. The staffing is at low levels.
That the government are putting more money into
the government is putting money into it. They'll probably all have to put money into it. I would ask why they put money into the railway and allow rolling stock companies and train operating companies and Network Rail subcontractors to extract billions of pounds of profit since the 90s straight into people's pockets in through dividends. So you'll do the same with health and all the rest of it eventually when you get the opportunity. So you'll fund them, but you'll shovel it into the private sector. That's what you've been doing. They take profits. They made profit every day during the pandemic, and they've made profit on every day of these strikes. They get protected against the loss of revenue, and they've not been affected, bottom line. 2 of the companies are subject to speculators' takeovers, and one of them has been taken over during this dispute. There's loads of money in the railway. It's being made by private sector operators. Get Porterbrook and all them down here and ask them what they've done with all the money. You funded that completely.
A minute ago you suggested that the public are behind you on that. That is not what latest figures show. It shows that public support is waning and that you don't any longer have the support of the public for these strikes. Is that concerning to you?
It depends which poll you read. I went on Good Morning Britain the other day where Richard Madeley was on attack mode. They did a poll shortly after that and said there was 75% support for the RMT. So it depends which poll you read of who's winning this. What was expected in the DFT is that we'd have zero support and we'd be back to work with no strikes by the end of June. Once your friends in the Daily Mail and the Telegraph and all these other journals followed me from my house to the station, invaded my children's Facebook pages and all the rest of it, that we would be public enemies number 1. We're not. I'm a more popular person than many of the politicians in this room, unfortunately, for the public. But the fact is that we have got a lot of support. It's difficult to get support during industrial disputes. But if you ask the public, do they sympathise with people getting a decent pay rise? Do they sympathise with the protection of contracts of employment and conditions? They will say yes. It's difficult to get that support going fully during intense industrial action, But there is broad support for all the people that are involved in disputes at this time, and there's very little for the support for the people that are opposing those disputes and trying to make people poorer.
Are you concerned about the increasing number of your members who are now turning out during strike days and turning up to work?
Well, we don't have those. We don't have reports. That's what we would call propaganda. That we're being told that.
No, those are actual figures. So
figures from who?
Figures from Network Rail, figures that are showing that increasing number of members of your unions now
are
actually turning up to work.
How do they know they're members of my union?
Well, I mean,
that's a protected characteristic.
There are more people
that's
who
a protected characteristic.
Work
but how do they know they're members of my union?
There were previously.
But how do they know they're members?
It's a pure fact.
Because one union is settled.
Sorry?
One union is settled. There are 43,000 people work for Network Rail. 21,000 of them are members of my union. Mm-hmm. So there would be more people at work than not on any strike day.
So it isn't concerning to you then that more are...
We don't have those reports. I get reports from picket lines all over the country that they are well attended and that the action we take is having the same effect as it did on day one.
Thank you, Chair.
If I could contribute, Chair, briefly.
Yes.
Our reports are 100% solid. What we are intrigued at, of course, is that on the non-strike days, other grade groups being paid to drive trains and setting the new rate of pay for the industry. So on top of the higher pay than we get, they get £500 a day in LNER. I believe in one of Mr Montgomery's companies, they're getting £300 a day on non-strike days for driving trains when we're not in dispute with them. So if that's going to set the tone and the level of what people should be paid in this negotiation, it will become increasingly interesting.
Frank, you kind of articulated the problem with the percentage increase a moment ago when you compared the wages of a ticket office staff to a senior manager. You're all very experienced trade unions, so I don't know whether you saw the article by two veteran government negotiators, Joe Haynes and Bernard Donoghue, on Friday in the Times, suggesting that a flat rate cash payment reflecting the increase in the cost of living for everybody might be a way to address the pay issue in this dispute. Is that at all feasible in your view? Just very brief, just yes or no answers would do.
Well, there's an element of that in one of the offers that we've got, and we're not averse to any sensible proposal. We'll consider it. It depends, what it is. But the format doesn't particularly bother me. We'll see whether it matches up to the problem or not.
Mick, again, we'd give due consideration to any offer that put a dent in the cost of living crisis. We'd be obliged to.
Right.
How we settled the pay claim for our own staff this year, actually, believe it or not. We would consider it, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you very much for your time this morning. Slightly overrun, but we've had a good airing of the issues. You're very welcome to stay for the second panel if you wish. We'll be putting some of the points raised to them. But for now, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And invite the next panellists to come forward, please.
That's an interesting response. What they should do, government having a sense as well, they should do what Joe Haynes and Bernard Donoghue suggested. Offer a flat rate reflecting the cost of living.
Network Rail, they've offered a minimum flat rate of £17.50, and then it's incremental on top. So they have almost done that.
Thank you. For the purposes of our record, could invite you to give your name and position, please. Start with Mr Montgomery.
Okay, Steve Montgomery. I'm the Managing Director of First Rail and also Chair of the Rail Delivery Group.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Tim Shriveller. I'm Managing Director for Network Rail's North West and Central region, but for the last 18 months or so I've been leading also in terms of the negotiations around reform.
Thank you. You were sitting in the back row for the first panel of witnesses. Can I start by putting the same question I put to the trade union representatives? And that is, on a, just to get a broad sense of where you see things are, on a scale of 1 to 10, how close do you think we are to getting a resolution to this? 1 being nowhere near, 10 being very close.
I think the challenge is depending what trade union you're speaking about. So if I take the 3 trade unions that were represented earlier, RMT, I believe that we have an opportunity to try and move forward. So I think we're within reasonable areas of where I think we can get a deal, but we have to work through it with them. Obviously, as it was indicated, there's further discussions tomorrow. So obviously we wait and see the outcome of that. TSSA in a very similar position where we've got further discussions tomorrow. ASLEF is slightly different, where we have been further behind with ASLEF. Obviously we made the offer last Friday. We've heard the reaction of ASLEF. We need to do more work with them and try and get back round the table. So that one is probably further behind the other 2 at this moment in time.
Thank you. I'll come back on the ASLEF point in a moment, but Tim, firstly, where do you see things from Network Rail's perspective?
Yes, there has been further progress, and of course in December we made the revised offer. So unfortunately, a 10 for the TSSA and Unite, which are part of the same negotiating group, because they're resolved, and that's good news. And those members of staff have now had that money for the controllers grade group, and as soon as we can resolve with RMT, then that will resolve those 2 unions. For RMT, 36% of their members that are Network Rail employees voted yes for the deal. So we're a bit short of the 50% that we need. There's a couple of thousand people that need to change their vote. So we met again with the RMT leadership yesterday for discussions, and we're planning to meet again next week. I'd place that as 7.
You're more optimistic than we've just heard from the trade unions that this can be resolved.
Well, particularly from the Network Rail disputes with the RMT, because that's the only one that's outstanding from our perspective, then yes, and I base that on the fact that say 36% of Network Rail members of the RMT voted yes for the deal. So we only need another, 2,000 people to change their views from an audience of over 20,000, and actually that deal will then, is then credible. So I think there's every chance by some very carefully targeted discussions at achieving that.
And for those people that you want to persuade to accept the offer, is that across the board of the union members, or are they in one particular sector of the industry?
Yeah, so this is absolutely within the Network Rail part of the population of RMT membership, and there are some specific areas of the deal that we're going to focus on. And where we know during the referendum that took place in December, because that referendum happened quite quickly, there were some quite complex parts to this deal. It does achieve quite a substantial change, and I think with hindsight it was clear that there were a number of questions, a number of issues that people had that weren't fully explained during that short referendum. So that's our approach.
Thank you. Mr Montgomery, can I just pick up on this offer that was put out to ASLEF last week, which you've heard this morning and in the press has provoked quite an angry reaction. Could you just talk me through why you put out the offer in this way, and perhaps in the expectation that the reaction would be what it's been?
Yeah, the situation with ASLEF, as I indicated earlier, it's not moved along as quickly as we would want it to, and that's been people's availability, those type of things. The negotiating teams have been speaking to ASLEF, they've made themselves available at certain times, but what's been quite clear through it is trying to put something down in paper to describe the wider areas of reform that we require. So, as Mr Whelan alluded to earlier on, the enabling framework agreement that we started off with at the beginning had a number of reform areas that we looked at. And when we talk about the 2 billion industry shortfall, when the pandemic struck, revenues obviously fell to as low as 5%. They've recovered roughly into the area about 80%. So that's a £2 billion shortfall in what we would normally expect to see in revenue for the industry. So we worked with the trade unions on how could the industry help meet that shortfall, work together, and looking at areas of where we can self-help. So areas of reform, workforce being part of that area, and there's other areas outside of that of where, you know, looking at different capitalisation of projects, these type of things. So that's what we've been trying to work with the trade unions. Those discussions have moved at various paces. RMT probably have been more engaged in some of the negotiations. ASLEF have been slightly behind, but we have been talking to them. It's not fair to say we haven't been talking to them. So when we've been over the last number of weeks, we're trying to lay out exactly what it is we're looking for. People have said that we haven't made an offer. We decided that we are going to make an offer to ASLEF. I tried to speak with Mr. Whelan between Christmas and New Year. He wasn't. He was looking to try and have a further meeting with the Minister. I then tried to speak to him last week to turn around and say, look, can I have a chat with you so we can start to talk about some of this? He was unavailable. I tried to phone him on the Friday morning to again update him on I was going to issue something. Unfortunately, he was tied up in meetings that day, and we left it to as late in the day as we could within office hours, and then we put the offer out at 3:15 in the afternoon.
So it's fair to say that you've made reasonable efforts to engage with ASLEF throughout this, and the offer that you put out on Friday late afternoon was, I don't want to say point of exasperation, but
I wouldn't say it was a point of exasperation. I think it was to try and lay out all the areas of reform that we were needing to do and put everything in one document that we could then allow us to use that document to move forward and, you know, as a negotiation. And that's what myself and the trade unions and Tim and the trade unions try to do, is have that negotiation so that we can try and flush out the areas of where we're in agreement or disagreement, and then try to work forward with that so that we can get some form of settlement to get this dispute off the table.
So, having listened to what they said earlier in this session, what's your next move to try and engage with ASLEF to...
Well, I think Mr. Whelan alluded that he has gone back to his board, his exec committee. They will look at that document, I believe it's next week, and they will come back to us after that with a response to that document, or maybe not a response, but they will come back in some shape or form. I would surmise that they will then turn around and say whether it's acceptable, reject it, whether they want to get into further talks to understand it more. So that's what we want to encourage, that we have a further discussion with ASLEF so that we can try and get through the document in more detail and then try and work to a solution to it.
I think I'm quoting him accurately when he said there wasn't one line in it that he could possibly accept. That doesn't sound terribly hopeful. So if that is their reaction when they've spoken to their executive, what comes next?
Well, again, I think they have to take it away, they have to read through it. I would say that there is a number of areas of where we can get common ground. You know, the thing that we've got to be quite clear is that we are not cutting people's wages, you know, they're out and increasing their hours. What we're trying to do is work within the frameworks that we have within the companies, so that we can then get greater productivity that provides a more punctual and reliable railway. And that's what we're trying to work with. And it makes us more cost effective then. You know, these type of reforms will make us more cost effective, less reliance on rest day working in these type of areas. So that makes the railway better. We can deliver that service for customers who, let's be fair, through all this process have the big people who've been most affected. And obviously then staff impacted on the strike action. So we've got to work together to try and resolve this.
Thank you. That's my questions for now. Turn next to Jack.
Thank you, Chair. And my questions are predominantly for Mr Montgomery. And in terms of making an improved offer to RMT and TSSA, what is that improved offer? Are you planning to make an improved offer to them?
Obviously, it's a negotiation. And it's confidential at this moment in time, so I wouldn't like to talk about what we're going to discuss tomorrow. I don't think that's respectful to the trade unions, and no disrespect to the committee, but you would understand my position. I think it's important that we have that discussion with the trade unions tomorrow and try and see if we can get common ground and move forward with the deal.
What is your understanding of where that common ground might be and how you can move these negotiations forward?
Again, I would rather take that and discuss that with the trade unions rather than debate it in the room here.
Okay. In terms of the ASLEF union, obviously we heard earlier, and we heard from a representative from Mick Lynch, and he basically said that he doesn't even recognise your existence and the existence of RDG. Do you think that that attitude has been helpful?
I think the language is something we have worked very closely with all the trade unions since the start of the pandemic through the Rail Industry Recovery Group. We have sat together, we've come up with enabling framework agreements that allowed us to look at these different areas of reform. So there is a recognition that as that body we have been doing. The role of RDG, RIRG gets a bit confused. I am the chair of RDG. They use myself as the chair of RDG to sit in RIRG, sorry, all these acronyms, to try and help facilitate the discussion between the trade unions. You know, myself and Tim, as I alluded earlier, are very experienced railway people. We've got a lot of knowledge of how the industry works, using that knowledge to then try and work with the trade unions to get the best outcome for passengers is what we're really trying to look for, and particularly during the pandemic and how we had to deal with staff and how all the restrictions that were applied. It's been a really important forum, and we've tried to continue that forum to then lead into the pay discussions that we've had and looking at taking the reforms that we talked about in the Rail Industry Recovery Group and trying to turn that into a package.
Do you think the approach that ASLEF have taken could be partly why, as you say, they are much further behind in those negotiations than the other two unions that you've been negotiating with?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things of where, you know, we just have to get more time in the room and try and work through the detail and a bit more. And I think ASLEF are you know, I think why we put the document out helps that situation, that it's more open and everybody then sees that key areas of where we believe reform can help drive the funding that we then need to give to our staff a pay increase. So it's important that we get all these items on the table and then we can discuss them with ASLEF.
What do you see now as the next steps of how you're going to move these negotiations forward, and how long do you think this is going to take?
Obviously RMT tomorrow, and TSSA tomorrow. Again, depending how those discussions go, will then dictate where we go with the next stage. ASLEF, as I say, waiting on feedback from them next week, and once we get that feedback, we will try and obviously re-engage as quickly as we can so that we can try and debate these areas of reform and hopefully get to something that we can move forward quickly. But I do accept that there's a number of challenges in
well,
that.
we heard from Mr Lynch his ballot for a further 6 months. We've heard from ASLEF that they are planning, you know, up to 2-3 years potentially. Are you going to allow it to go on that long?
Certainly we don't want to. You know, we have been quite clear we want to try and get resolvement of these disputes. It does take both parties. We want to sit down with RMT, TSSA and ASLEF to try and resolve this as quickly as we can. This is hurting the industry. You know, we've got to be quite clear that this is hurting the industry. And some of the questions that were asked earlier, where we are seeing customer confidence in this industry ebbing away every day. We see it when strikes happen, the disruption with action short of strikes where people don't become available to cover turns at short notice. These things are all impacting and customers are starting to use other modes of transport. So we've got to sit with the trade unions, we've got to try and get ourselves sorted out so that we can then start to provide a service for customers. So that's really important. That's where Tim, are really focused on, is getting the dispute resolved as quickly as we can so that we can then restore the services.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Graham.
Thanks very much, Chair. So some of the areas we've already covered. Good morning, gentlemen. But just to in relation to the ASLEF offer, you know, I think you were in for the earlier session. But, in relation to the offer that was made on the Friday, Mick Lynch did explain to the committee, because of the fragmented nature of the rail industry, he's dealing with various bargaining units in Scotland, in Wales, Merseyrail, and so on. So I think it's understandable. There are many time pressures, that's even without the freight side of things, where the disputes have been resolved, that perhaps he isn't instantly available. But it does seem to have caused some angst. That I did make a note of the time at 15:38, I think he said.
18.
Sorry, 32?
18.
15:18, okay. Is that the Ballacressy? No, he did make a comment that he thought it had undermined good faith in the process to make that offer directly to the members. So it's just to point that out. But given that you were in agreement with the £2 billion figure that I think that Mick Lynch, well, in fact the whole panel agreed with, in terms of reducing costs, I wonder if you would give the committee some insight as to how the modelling works. For example, the plan to close the ticket offices. I don't know if that's Mr. Shoveler's area really. How much saving would that bring about? Some of the other elements, there's a lot of talk about. I've heard Mr. Shoveler on the TV talking about the need to improve safety and to have workers not exposed to risk and so on. But some of the new technologies, driver-only operation, will surely require significant investment in signalling and so on. So how does the cost modelling reflect in this £2 billion worth of savings?
Again, without getting into the mega detail of it all, so the workforce reform areas has got various packages, and we talk about the rationalisation of ticket offices. Again, I don't know how much money we will save in that at the moment, because we have to go through a public consultation document should we go ahead with it. We would have to go through public consultation. When we complete that public consultation, that then has to be submitted to the DFT, and somebody has to opine on whether that booking office can close or whether we can reduce the hours on it. And that's how the process works at this moment. So until you get through that whole process, you don't actually know how much money you could potentially save. But again, just to be clear, in a lot of booking offices, we are not talking about unstaffing stations. This is one point we need to be quite clear. It's about moving people from out behind the ticket office window onto platforms, able to give a greater service, hopefully, to customers. But, where you want to make sure that people are there to deal with more vulnerable individuals. Those individuals who we take out from behind the glass can sell the same types of ticket via the ticket vending machines, or they can help customers get a ticket if it's a unique thing, which is but 1% of tickets. If it's something unique, they can help the customer out. But when they're out from behind the glass, if they see a vulnerable individual, somebody needing assistance, whether it's a child on and off a train or wheelchair assistance, they are there then, rather than behind the glass.
I understand that, but surely there must be some costings as to what the cost benefit are to I don't know whether you're using the term repurposing, but however we describe it, the closure of the ticket office is quite a lot. How many ticket offices are we talking about?
So there's roughly about 998, I think the figure is that we mention in documentation.
I understand that the trade unions have submitted a complaint to the Central Arbitration Committee on the grounds that you're refusing to disclose information that relates to the modelling of costs, not just in relation to ticket offices, but in relation to the anticipated cost reductions of driver-only operation as well. How are you responding to that?
We're dealing with it at this current time. It's obviously something that's live, so we are dealing with it at this moment in time.
We've heard from the trade unions previously, and indeed we've got the Rail Minister coming next week, but we had the Secretary of State giving evidence to the committee, and he's been quite definite, and he said, he told the committee on the 21st of December, I'm encouraging the trade unions and employees to get round the table, hammer out that deal on workforce reform, which delivers some of the financial savings that can help make a better pay offer. Now, we've heard that really your hands are tied through the mandate and the contract. So what kind of interaction are you having with the Secretary of State in relation to the preconditions that are being placed on you?
So obviously government have the overall funding of the industry. The contracts that are now set up, particularly for train operating companies, we are very much reliant and going back to government, and as it was alluded to earlier on, we have to ensure that we seek permission before we were to do anything, or it becomes what they call a disallowable cost. But that's why myself and the negotiating team for the train operating companies, we're trying to do this centralised framework agreement so that we can then go to government and say, look, we believe that we've negotiated these areas of reform, we believe it could be worth X, Y and Z, and we believe this could result in a pay increase of whatever that pay increase is, and we want to be able to offer that to the trade unions, and that is obviously put in and submitted to the DFT, and then either people believe that that is the case, and obviously people have to check these things, and we will get a mandate back on what we believe is a sensible offer.
I just want to put something, I'm grateful for that response. I just want to put something to you, just from previous evidence sessions, when we've had other train operators, notably Northern Rail, who were the principal operator in my area, and indeed Avanti, and when we've asked them about their view on driver-only operation, particularly for Northern Rail, where many of the stations, including those in my constituency, are unmanned, it isn't something that they think is either desirable or that the network is currently formulated and would support. Is there pressure from your own membership in relation to this precondition on accepting driver-only operation, or is this something that's been specified by the Secretary of State and the DFT?
So the driver-only operation, or driver-controlled operation, is something that we have been speaking to the trade unions about for many, many years, as you know. There is approximately 45% of services that currently operate driver-only operation or driver-controlled operation. I'm sorry, these two terminologies are the distinct difference in a lot of these cases is there is a second person on the back of the train that deals with the customer service element. Some pure driver-only operations, you might not have a second person on the train. So what we've been talking to the trade unions right from the outset, from the enabling framework agreement and over many years, driver-only operation or driver-controlled operation is not something new. So these discussions have always happened and will probably continue to happen in the future. The key area for us is where can we make it more reliable and more punctual for customers? The example is we are sitting at Waterloo, we're bringing new trains in into, potentially into South Western Railways. If we have driver-only operation or driver-controlled operation, can we get trains out more punctual, more reliable? If there's disruption in the network and the guard that's coming in has been delayed, could we put that train out on time and get the guard to join the train at another point? And that's the type of areas, that flexibility that we're trying to do. But that can only happen where the infrastructure and the trains are able to cope with that. And the industry across a lot of the network is not in that shape yet because the trains are not capable of doing it. So it's only where the trains and the infrastructure are able to do it and the trains are equipped to do that and bought and brought in to do that, that we will then use that type of equipment.
I might say my last experience, which was last Friday on the Lumo train from Newcastle, it was late 2.5 hours because of camera failures on the train. I'll hand my chair.
Thank you. Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Jem. Good morning, Steve, and Tim, nice to see you. Steve, I just wanted to briefly ask you about the DOO, DCO point, and I'm going to move on to Tim to talk about the RMT negotiations. Just so we're clear on the whole sort of DCO, DOO proposition, what sort of percentage? There's a lot of concern, I think it's fair to say, that from members of the public, borne by what they've heard from what the unions have had to say, that there is a proposal to make the entire railway DOO. Now, I think hearing from what you've just had to say, that is absolutely not the case. But could you just be a little bit more explicit as to, you know, the sort of conversations you're having about it, and maybe what sort of percentage of the railway, if you can put it in those terms, you're potentially seeking to have conversations about in that respect.
Yeah, I think where we're looking at the moment is, and again, just to be clear, even any of the proposals or the thinking is, and certainly in a lot of routes, is not to have only the driver on the train. We always see in a lot of occasions where we would see a second person for customer service revenue protection. So it's not to take people off the train fully. It's about punctuality, reliability. The trains themselves, the only way that you can move this forward, are they fitted to be able to operate with cameras so that the driver can see all the doors? Yeah. So at the moment, and I don't have the exact figure, Chris, but at the moment there's a number of trains in service that we could probably use more effectively. If future trains are ordered in with that type of equipment and the infrastructure is capable of coping with that, then we would like to use that again to drive punctuality and reliability. It has been proven that with the driver opening and closing the doors, it saves the on-train person having to run away for a customer to go and operate the doors.
So for example, the lines and trains, take the Waterloo-Weymouth line, Waterloo-Exeter line, for example, where the trains are not accommodated to do it, the infrastructure does not exist, there is no appetite whatsoever.
There'll be no change. Where the trains are not equipped, and we have a lot of trains that are not equipped to be able to do that at this moment in time.
Yeah, thank you very much. Tim, can I come to you next?
Just something there. I just want to be clear, because you've told my colleague there, Mr. Loader, that there's no plan to do it on every train. But yet the proposal actually says that the driver-only operation will be the default mode on every train. That's the proposal you're giving to the train.
Sorry, where the train is equipped to be able to do it. There's a lot of trains that are not equipped to be able to do driver-only operation.
And is there that qualification in the agreement?
Yeah, and what we are saying is, clearly the trade unions understand that where there is a train, a train that was built, I don't know, let's call it in 2000, it doesn't have the cameras fitted within the cabs, it doesn't have the cameras outside the doors, so you wouldn't, you could go and spend a lot of money and convert the train, but in these circumstances, what we're saying is, where the trains are currently equipped to be able to do that, or there is new trains brought into service, then we would look to try and use that facility on the train, and again to drive punctuality and reliability.
That's reflected in the agreement, or in the proposal?
The understanding's certainly there, with the trade unions. I don't think there's any misunderstanding in that area.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tim, I just wanted to come back to you to ask if you could give us a sort of an update from your perspective, please, on the situation with negotiations with the RMT as it is today.
Yeah, so we met yesterday with the leadership of the RMT, Mr. Lynch and Mr. Dempsey, and we were having discussions because the offer that we made in December was a substantial offer, and as I mentioned earlier, has been accepted by 2 of the 3 trade unions. So we wanted to hear from the leadership of the RMT their views on why the RMT have been unable to support and recommend the deal, as we'd hoped they would have done when we made the offer in December, and they sent it out with a recommendation to the members to reject the deal, which we know caused some people to vote no, and to understand any other details that they particularly wanted to feed back on that have been causing concern. And we were also able to suggest some areas where, based on the discussions that we've been having with our staff members, some of the feedback that we had after the referendum in December, where people had said to us, look, this is I didn't quite understand this point, or could you explain this to me again, or I've got a question about it. And as I said, because it was quite a short referendum and there was little time to prepare for it, didn't give time for some of the materials and some of the briefing that I think we both wanted to do to make sure that both representatives and managers could have answered the questions, the genuine questions that our employees had. That process didn't work effectively at all. So what we'd like to do is really understand, and we have been doing that over this Christmas period, and again hearing from the union yesterday, which are those areas that we should now specifically go back to provide further discussion and confidence for our employees, with the objective of being able to have a further referendum at the right moment.
Do you have any insights currently as to what those specific remaining issues are that require resolution?
Yes, I do. I think there are 2 or 3 areas that have become very clear based on the feedback we've had from employees and actually broadly similar to the things that I'm hearing from the RMT as well. So that allows us to target very clearly the things that we can perhaps provide some further guidance on, some areas that perhaps we didn't explain very well, and therefore by doing that better, it gives our employees a better opportunity to understand just how good this deal can be for them. Because, as we've said, you're aware of the 5% offer that we've made for 2022, but as the trade unions and General Secretary of the TSSA agreed, that comes with an underpin of £1,750. Now, for some members, some of our employees that are on, say, £30,000 or less, that means the deal's worth over 10%, not 9%, over 10%, and more the further you go down the pay scales. So this is, especially for the lower paid members of staff, a valuable deal. And, of course, it comes with all the other things we've talked about, like that the union have asked for, like a guarantee around no compulsory redundancies till January 2025. And, of course, the discounted rail travel for the employee and their dependents, which, again, is something the union have been asking for a long time. So there's as well as the cash, there's a number of other elements to this deal which we think recognise the challenge environment that we're in, recognise the economic circumstance and the cost of living issues and inflation, but also so make it an affordable deal, but also making it an attractive deal, because we're trying to look after those who need the support.
Yeah. You will probably have heard me ask the General Secretary of the RMT earlier about how rock solid his members were in the strikes over the last 5-6 weeks or so. I just wondered if you had any insights or observations that you might be able to offer in respect to that question I asked earlier.
Yeah, I think the strikes have been underway now for a very long period of time, but we have absolutely seen in the last set of strikes, those just before and then especially after Christmas, that there has been a return to work by a number of employees, both in maintenance and operations. It's very localised. It tends to be groups of people that will come back in rather than individuals on their own. But nevertheless, yes, there's clearly a pattern of that we can see emerging.
And would you say that some employees who are also members of the RMT, in this example, are now in the situation where they want to come back to work, and maybe the shortened referendum period that we saw last month might not have given them enough time to properly digest what was on the table, and actually we might be in a position of real optimism here?
Well, absolutely. I'm perpetually optimistic, because in doing these type of roles, we have to, despite all of the challenges, we have to keep searching repeatedly for an area where we have alignment, where we have something that we can build on. And I think this is a particular area now that, yes, it's quite clear that from the discussions that I have when I go around talking to my team, to my staff, what I see from my email inbox and contacts that I receive, that yes, there was a general feeling from a lot of people that before Christmas the referenda was too short, didn't allow people time to ask the questions they had. And yeah, I think those employees that have come back into work, obviously that's been a substantial thing for those groups. It's not done lightly, and it's not the way that we want to resolve the dispute either. It's not. We didn't set out to break the strike. We set out to run the train service safely and reliably, even on days when the RMT were not at work, and we'll continue to do that. And indeed, we'll look to. Should there be more strikes, and I severely hope there aren't, but should there be more strikes, then we will look to run more trains next time, because our capability to do that is growing. But our main effort is to make sure that is just try and find a way of clarifying those questions that people have, so we can find a way of resolving it.
Thank you. And just finally, Tim, from me, it's clear that you've made a lot of progress and indeed resolved the dispute with the TSSA and Unite in terms of the Network Rail's relationship. I just wondered if you would like to briefly share any insights as to why it may have been quicker or easier to come to a settlement with those unions rather than, as you're finding it, you haven't come to that conclusion at the moment with the RMT.
Yes, I mean, there's no doubt that the fact that the TSSA, for example, recommended to its members to vote yes for the deal helped. Because, of course, a lot of, I really feel for our employees, we've all been there actually. These are very confusing times, aren't they? They receive messages from management, they receive messages from unions, and understanding the detail of a deal or a proposal is complex. So therefore, sometimes employers will listen very clearly to what the union is saying, and when a union suggests, yes, we think this is a deal that you should support, that clearly brings with it a weighting, doesn't it? And TSSA did, and we had a high response, a very positive response from TSSA members. That was not the case with RMT. We'd hoped that RMT would support the deal. They weren't able to support the deal. In fact, they recommended to members to vote no. And despite that, 36% of members voted yes. And I think that's quite significant. And that's one of the things that gives me optimism to think we're on the right track.
Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you. Graham, did you have any supplementaries on this point before we turn to Mike and Gavin?
Well, I was just wondering about the additional costs, particularly on strike days, of accommodating people in hotels. We heard from the earlier panel of supplementary sums that were being paid to replacement train drivers. Is there an estimate of the costs that the employers are incurring in such additional expense?
I don't have an estimate of the cost, but obviously the reason why we do that is to try and provide a service for customers on these strike days. So there is a cost for that, but there's also an even bigger cost if we weren't to do that, and the lost revenue that we would see. So it's really important that we try and provide as many services, albeit limited, as we can by using these staff to come out and do these additional duties.
Yeah. And these would often presumably be managers who had previously done these roles in the past.
Predominantly, yes. Yeah.
And you're very confident about the safety aspect there of using managers and others in these positions.
Yeah, on those individuals have to be trained to a certain standard, and then on the day we put additional people out to monitor that to make sure that the people are doing what they're meant to do. Because obviously we have to work with the Office of the Rail Regulator to make sure that we've got a sensible and safe method of operation during strike days.
I'd just like to build on that as well, because the comment was made here that not people who aren't qualified have been used to run signal boxes. That's absolutely manifestly not the case. There's no circumstance in which we'd allow that to happen. Absolutely sure through assessment and independent validation that our managers that are working in those signal boxes are competent. They've done a super job. But building on that, what I would say is that because they've protected sort of critical national infrastructure, the supplies of freight to power stations, some of the critical things. If you think back to sort of June when we were having these first discussions, there was a real concern around how freight would be impacted and critical national supplies. Biomass to power stations is a particular example, and I'm very pleased that actually, whilst it's a shame it was necessary, we have managed to make sure those things have run, those trains have run, the critical national infrastructure has been protected. So that's why we've been investing in making sure that managers can do that competently, safely. If there's incidents on the railway every day, on strike and non-strike days, they're all investigated the same way, to the same standard. And finally, my point, recognising that some of those managers perhaps wouldn't have been in those posts for some years, a long time since I've worked a train, one of the reasons why we reduce the number of trains on those days is so that managers aren't under the same pressure and as a normal member of staff would be. One of the reasons why we thin the service out a bit to make sure that actually they've had the ability over the now 19 strike days to refamiliarise themselves with those roles and become not only competent but proficient in dealing with situations that have occurred, and we've got a lot of evidence that's been the case.
And those safety incidents would all be documented.
Absolutely.
Yes, and I'm just thinking back to Friday. It was a non-strike day when I travelled. There was only 2 trains in the northeast running. Yeah. And the one I got was 2.5 hours late. Thank you.
We investigate the same any incident that occurs, which is investigated the same on a strike day as a non-strike day, independently reviewed, and of course the objective is always to understand why, so we can help people improve. And again, that's the same whether there's a strike or not.
Thank you. Now I want to turn to the role of the government. Mike and then Gavin have some questions on that. Mike.
Yes, I mean, this is to you both, and I'll start with Tim first. Hello as well. Hello to you both. Has the new Secretary of State and Rail Minister taken a different approach to their predecessors in terms of negotiations, or are they still throwing a spanner in the works?
Well, Network Rail's in a slightly different position than the train companies because, as an arm's length body, we are governed by the public sector pay arrangements. But nevertheless, we've throughout this kept the Department for Transport fully aware of the changes and the proposals that we've been making, and indeed asked their support as public sector pay guidelines required. I think I have seen the most notable difference, of course, is that the current Secretary of State and current Rail Minister have met physically with the trade union leaders, which didn't occur before. But other than that, I can see no difference, because throughout this process we have, as I've said a number of times to this committee, that there's enough money in the railway to do what needs to be done. The challenge is to create efficiency and do that safely, so we improve the service to passengers and freight customers. So what we've done throughout this is to identify the changes that we want to make. In this case, maintenance particularly is the area where it was important to save money, to improve the reliability of the railway as well through the use of technology, meaning we need less people, which was undoubtedly one of the things at the beginning of the dispute the RMT were concerned about particularly. So we made the business case. We demonstrated to government that by reducing 1,850 members of staff, that would provide, allow us to achieve the savings we needed to make, and would provide a package for pay. So we asked government support and approval to make that packet, and that was given back in June. We did it again in December, and again that was given in December for the award that we made, for the offer that we made in early December. So tone I hear, but in terms of the practical process, no, the process hasn't changed from my perspective.
So you said there's a difference in tone?
Well, notably, that quite obviously insofar as the fact that the current Secretary of State and the current Rail Minister have met on a number of occasions with the trade unions directly. That didn't occur before. But that didn't help me resolve the disputes with the TSSA or Unite. It's not preventing me from resolving the disputes with the RMT.
A similar response. I think the fact that the ministers have met with the trade unions, the general secretaries of the trade unions, and the rail minister is now acting in the role of trying to facilitate further discussions with allowing the employer and the trade unions to get away and try to understand the areas of differences. But ultimately it's back to myself and Tim to lead the discussions with the trade union and try to get the deal on the table. So yes, there is greater engagement, but we're ultimately myself and Tim to sort it out.
I mean, you referred to closing ticketing offices, driverless trains, a whole set of demands around in terms of reference seems to be driven by the DfT, ultimately ministers, and yet, by your own admittance, you seem to be pretty clueless how much that would save you. The work's not been done, and yet the ministers seem to be claiming where that money, that's where the money will come from. So is that putting a spanner in the works? Is that a hindrance, or is that helpful?
Well, first of all, it's myself that come up with the areas of reform as in the industry. It's come up with the areas of reform in terms of the financials of that. What I alluded to earlier on is we don't know the final number because we don't know how many booking office staff would be repurposed into other roles, etc. So there is overall figures that we've got, but we cannot tie it down to a final figure until we get through the areas of reform. We put numbers against different areas of reform. We talk about these large ticket items of which is DCO, DOO, etc. There's a lot of smaller areas of reform that actually could generate just as significant amounts of money as DCO, DOO. But we need to go through with the trade unions and try and resolve some of them. And again, it's back to, it's not about people working longer, it's about trying to get greater efficiency within the hours that we have people in the workplace. And that's just about tweaks in terms and conditions, not about wholesale throwing everything out.
Moving on slightly, well documented, in fact, on the floor of the House yesterday, we had the statement in terms of the draconian legislation to effectively, or try to ban strikes. That's what it is, known as the minimum service levels of agreement. Now, the previous bill, the previous impact assessment, actually came back saying, look, actually this would aggravate matters. It lead to further industrial strife, further industrial action. What's your assessment? I'll take it with you Steve, first.
Until I see the legislation, I have not seen the detail of it, and we've not been privy to what it will really mean in terms of, is it 30%, 40%, 50% minimum service levels. So we have not seen that detail. So when the legislation, if the legislation gets through, we will then work with that once we understand it. But at the moment, we don't have any other insight than what's been announced.
Same position, actually, yes. I mean, there is a difference between how a minimum service might be applied in a signal box, for example, than a train, because the signal box is either open or shut. It's binary, whereas trains, you can have more or fewer of them. So we need to understand how legislation would apply in those types of circumstances, and we haven't seen the detail yet to be able to do that.
Would you run a safe railway with this form of provision in place and curtailing the right for employees to withdraw their labour?
Well, we would only ever operate a safe rail. If it's not safe, we won't do it. What I can say is that in previous experience, much earlier in my career when I used to work for Eurostar, I saw on a number of occasions in France how, not through legislation, but through the way the trade unions are structured differently, how very frequently when there were industrial action in France, some train service would run, but not all of it, depending on which trade unions were at work and which were not. That was quite a frequent, I have to say, event at that particular time back in the 90s. So I think perhaps caused by a different thing, but nevertheless the effect was the same, which was that some trains ran and other trains didn't. I've no reason to see why that in itself creates an issue of safety.
Have you had any discussions with ministers about this?
I've not been involved in any discussions with ministers, no.
Minimum service levels? No, I've no.
No discussions whatsoever?
They've talked to us that there was legislation coming, but not in the detail of it in any way at all, no.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Okay. Thank you, Gavin.
Thanks very much, Chair. I have a number of questions here, but I realise I'll trample over my colleague's question at 15, so I will refrain and keep my questions fairly tight. If I could start just briefly on this point, just for clarity, Mr Montgomery, in terms of obviously the industrial action over the past months, how much are the train operating companies indemnified against the cost essentially of these strikes?
So the contracts are set out obviously over the year, depending what contract you're on, whether it's a national rail contract or emergency measures agreement. So you're measured over the year. You're giving a small percentage to operate the service, and then there's performance fees. On the days that are strikes, then you would exclude that. They would be excluded from the performance days. But then you're still measured over the other 300 and X days that strikes are not happening on. So that's how it's measured, and that's done by an independent body at the end of the year to evaluate how you've delivered.
Okay, and I suppose could you, a rough percentage then, in terms of percentage, who meets the cost of this? Is it the DFT and the taxpayer? Is it TOC? In terms of what percentage do the TOCs actually meet in this, or are you completely indemnified and it's the taxpayer that pays for it?
So in terms of the cost of it, in terms of the staff salaries, in terms of the loss of revenue, that all sits with government now. When we moved obviously from the franchising arrangements into the emergency measures agreement and now NRCs, all the risk of cost and revenue sits with government now.
That was my understanding, but thanks for putting that on the record. Can I ask this from a TOC or RDG perspective? You may have heard me ask the previous panel. What's your take on the difference in approach to negotiations and disputes from the Scottish Government, or indeed other devolved administrations and UK Government?
Again, I'm not involved in discussions with these other government bodies. I don't deal with them.
You chat to colleagues about them?
Again, I don't deal with them. I don't have an opinion on it because I don't have enough knowledge of it, if I'm perfectly honest with you.
Okay, but obviously as a former MD of ScotRail, you'll be obviously more privy or more aware of these sort of situations. It's now nationalised, obviously, but in general terms than many others. So just the agreement, the ScotRail agreement that's now in place is made up of a percentage that's being paid by ScotRail and a percentage that's been paid by Scottish Government or Transport Scotland government agency. As a former MD of ScotRail, would you agree that if ScotRail significantly inflated track access charges were more in line with the rest of the UK rail industry, they'd be able to pay more of that settlement from their own resources?
I don't know what ScotRail's track access charges are, I'll be perfectly honest with you. That's a matter for Scottish Government, and with Network Rail, I, as the chair of RDG, do not get involved in that element of it.
I'm not playing poker with you, Mr. Montgomery. But I suppose this last question for Mr. Shoveler, the point was made in the last session about the service that is offered on strike days and in the days in between strike days, whereby the network out with the southeast and perhaps the spine of southern central UK and what have you is largely either not get a service at all or very, very poor service. So if you look at Scotland and the northern regions and what have you, very poorly served compared to other parts of the UK. Why is that?
Well, it's a question that's been asked a number of times. The approach to how each area is going to be served has been driven by a number of things, and I've talked about critical freight routes, for example. I've talked about making sure that for every manager that we have, they can control the largest possible area of the most critical infrastructure. So obviously, you have the key route between London and Scotland, and into Glasgow, for example, was a priority that's been open throughout. Within Scotland itself, for example, then my colleague Alex Hines is responsible for, so he's decided how to use the managers he's got to open that network. That's not a matter for Network Rail overall. That's been locally decided the same way as in my region. I've decided how best to use my competent managers to protect the things that are most important. Typically, the things that have weighted on that for me, as I said, have been critical national freight that has to be moved, and then where we're opening passenger lines, how we can move the largest number of passengers with the fewest number of managers. And there's no doubt that where you end up with more modern signalling installations, for example, one person can control many, many miles of track because the signalling runs largely automatically and it's supervised. Whereas, of course, in more rural locations, typically, sometimes, it requires one person to perhaps just do 5 miles of track and physically move points and move signals. So on that basis, it's far, you're going to open a much smaller part of the railway if you deploy your managers to those locations. It's all been led by what's the right thing for freight and what's the right thing for our passengers.
Okay, I'm very conscious of time, Chair. So.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Chair. Just to build on my colleague's comments there, I mean, if you look in the northeast, we've seen some massive disruption, and then when Network Rail strike went on last week, my constituents were left without a single train service. Why is it that strikes in Network Rail have shut down local rail services in the northeast, but haven't done so elsewhere? Why is it as dramatic as that?
Okay, and obviously we apologise to all the passengers that were inconvenienced by that. But I don't think there is a difference. The situation you described in the northeast, in some parts of Scotland, in my area, in the northwest, in the south, it's exactly the same. The focus has been on moving the largest number, offering service to the largest number of people and the largest number of freight companies, and that typically means the main lines stay open, but the secondary routes, the routes that are serving communities, but perhaps not having critical freight on them, are much less likely to be opened. And typically on those local lines, the number of signallers that's required to operate each section of route is much, much higher than on the main lines. So unfortunately, it's a function of that prioritisation around freight, passengers, and getting as much mileage open as we can for each person that we have.
Okay, I think there's a possible another consideration that it should be about the criticality of the user as opposed to the volume that you're putting through. But we're conscious of time as well, so I'll push on. So I've got a little bit of a similar comment to Steve in terms of, they were going to shut Sunderland station down completely, and then they had a local outcry, and all of a sudden it got changed. Surely you should be in the best place in the first place. You shouldn't need local kickback to get to that situation.
I think, as Tim alluded to, it's how do we try and serve the masses, and that is very, very difficult, and there's a lot of decisions have to be made. Again, it's what infrastructure can be made available. It is difficult to balance it. I do know that Network Rail have done a huge amount of work to try and get as many signal boxes and continue every strike day to enhance the service. And it's just where do we prioritise, and work with Network Rail to make sure we provide the best service. So it is a bit of, we're trying to do our best with it. And as I say, Network Rail are getting more and more people starting to be available to open these areas.
As I say, I'm conscious that we're tight on time, but really I would like you to make sure you're getting a good look at what people need as opposed to just the volume game. But the one point that I do really want to put down from the committee point of view, when you looked at and you listened to the first session, there's some quite robust discussions about the fact that the Secretary of State was actively blocking improvements. That this was a DFT-led frustration that was going on. That the RMT said the government will simply not give a mandate, to Network Rail. Do you recognise that?
Not to Network Rail, no. So I think that may be a confusion. So the government has given a mandate, did give a mandate to Network Rail, and did again so in December. So we have had mandate from DFT.
Does it need a new mandate? Does it need something different to get from past where we are now?
No, I think the mandate that we have is the one that I asked for, is the one that I can afford. As I've explained, we funded this deal through efficiencies. I can't ask for a mandate that I can't afford to pay.
So you don't recognise government interference as deliberately trying to frustrate the deal, which was the implication from the first session?
It's not been an issue from that I've had visibility of.
Steve?
So I have received a further mandate, which will be used tomorrow in talking with the trade unions. But again, for obvious reasons, the confidentiality of that is something that I can't talk about. So I think, again, as Tim says, we have to put proposals forward to government using our expertise in areas of reform that we can then put forward a sensible proposal, which obviously ultimately government do sign off and give us the mandate. So, but we have got a revised mandate for this week for TSSA and RMT.
Yeah, I could talk for a while, Chair.
Thank you. Jack, you want a very quick supplementary?
Yeah, thank you, Chair.
Then for the last question.
Just relates to what we were saying a minute ago about the service on strike days, and Stoke-on-Trent is another one of those areas that doesn't have any service at all on strike days. I've had to drive on a number of occasions to East Midlands Parkway to get the train down to London. So are you going to look more at, as Paul was saying, about the actual economic impact that that's having? Obviously, it's having a severe economic impact on those areas like Stoke-on-Trent City without any services at all on strike days. Could you please look at and consider more the economic impacts of a lack of service on strike days?
Yes, as an absolutely point, and I said earlier that it's our intention that hopefully there won't be more strike days, but if there are more strike days, we are certainly going to, we're working hard with our colleagues to try and open more of the network and see if we can run more trains. However, if opening Stoke-on-Trent meant closing somewhere else, then of course it's robbing one to pay the other. And the assessment we've made so far is that for those critical national freight flows, for example, that have a value to the whole country, those are the things that have been leading our priorities.
Are either of you aware of any other country in Europe that's now suffered 8 months of travel disruption because of an unresolved industrial dispute on their railways?
I'm not aware of any. At this moment in time.
And we've heard that disputes have been settled in Scotland, in Wales, Merseyside, London. Why do you think that uniquely the bit of railway in Europe that the UK government is responsible for has not been able to resolve an industrial dispute?
just take some of that. I mean, I think we have been able to resolve some industrial disputes with Unite, with TSSA, for the same grade group that we're talking about here with the RMT, and of course with our managers back in the summer. So I think there has been progress. It's been a very difficult and complex, and of course I think so much of this goes back to particularly COVID and the way that
every other country in Europe suffered COVID, and so has Scotland and so has Wales.
Yeah, okay, but from an infrastructure perspective, I think the thing that we're clear on is we needed to save some money. It was clear that the efficiency of the railway was that
not really answering the question. Mr. Montgomery, do you want to have a go at that?
Well, I think the fact is, again, just let's be fair, Scotland did suffer a large number of strike days before it was resolved as well, so it's not been a simple process. What we've got to do is, how do we make this railway, to protect it for the future, how do we economically protect it? By making sure that we work together with the trade unions. That's a really important thing, is we work with the trade unions to try and secure the long-term future of the industry and the employees within the industry. And that's where we're trying to move towards at this moment in time.
Why do you think the disputes have been settled in Scotland and Wales and London and Merseyside, not in England?
Again, I think it's been negotiation and compromise on both sides, and that's why they've got to a settlement. So we're still at that stage of trying to get compromise and settlement between ourselves and the trade unions. And we look, I think we paint a picture. It's a long period of time. None of us like to see what's happening to customers at the moment.
Can you see that a sort of an ordinary member of the public looking in on this, and looking in on the fact that this ongoing dispute that's still not resolved is a uniquely England problem in the bits of England where the Department of Transport are responsible, is going to reach the conclusion and agree with the unions that this is a UK government problem. It's a problem with government, not with the unions.
Again, as I can only talk about the discussions that we have with the trade unions, it takes both teams to operate together to try and get to a solution. Whether it's UK government or whatever government, we have to deal with what we've got in front of us at this moment in time. We are working with the trade unions to try and get a resolvement in this, but it does take both sides. We cannot, and we have to ensure that we can continue to make sure that the railway is sustainable for the future. And that means that both sides, the trade union, management, trying to thrash out a sensible deal that we can then obviously give our employees a pay increase at the end of. But how do we make the railway more sustainable for customers for the future as well as everybody else?
Can you put a figure on how much the government will have to reimburse you for losses on strike days?
We don't receive any payment for losses on strike days.
But you are indemnified, aren't you, for the cost of the strike by the government?
So government have a revenue with them and have costs with them. Yeah. So the operator, as in each of the train operating companies, does not own the cost or the revenue.
So what is that figure? Do you know what that figure is?
The loss of revenue on the day, it varies. I don't have the exact figure for you. But
the total, you have no idea of what the total is?
I've got a very kind of headline figure. I couldn't give you an exact figure.
I think one of the unions wrote to us suggesting it was 318 million so far.
Over all the strike days, that number will be quite high. Yeah, it'll be in that region, 300 to 500 we would
That's quite a sizable amount of money that might have gone to help resolve this dispute in terms of offering the workers a better deal, isn't it?
I mean, lost revenue isn't the same as increased costs, obviously. So, and it's a tragedy to lose the revenue, but of course that's money that hasn't come into the industry, whereas obviously the increase in
the money that the taxpayer is having to fork out because of the government's failure to reach a deal with the unions is money that could have been put into that offer and resolved this dispute months ago.
As I say, I think we have to come back to the situation of where we started this whole process, that the industry is only 80% of the revenue that it had previously, yet it's got 100% of the costs.
Yes.
So how do we work together with the trade unions to try and ensure that we can reduce some of the cost of the industry and then regrow the revenue back? And I think that's the challenge for us. I think we've got to be clear, the industry over the last 20 years has grown and grown. There's more people employed within the rail industry in the UK. There's greater revenues. But the pandemic, as you said, affected everybody, all businesses. We're looking at the railway, how do we start to grow that back now? But we have to take measures to self-help because we can't keep taking taxpayers' money all the time, because we know the pressures on the other sectors. So it's how do we work with the trade unions to try and achieve that savings within the cost numbers, and then allow us to grow forward. And as I say, my own opinion is, being in the industry for a long time, we have seen peaks and troughs. Yes, this is an extremely difficult and different situation we've experienced, but the industry does come back again, and we can grow passenger numbers.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time this morning. Appreciate there's lots still going on, and we hope that the ongoing negotiations will come to a satisfactory conclusion. Thank you. Order.
Thank you.
The